Blackbeard is trapped, not on the open sea, not in the vast waters where he usually disappears, but inside a narrow inlet so shallow that the moment his ship turns, the keel scrapes the rocks. Ahead of him, a small vessel blocks the only way out, standing still like a stake driven into the water. Behind him, the tide pushes in, sails heavy, dragged downward as if the sea itself is pulling them back. On deck, the men who once made the entire coastline tremble fall completely silent. Not because they've lost their nerve, but because they understand something brutal. In confined space, power stops being an advantage and turns into a burden. Lightning rips across the sky, a flash of light sweeping over a soaked black beard, cold eyes, and wisps of smoke clinging to his coat like the mark of a legend. Blackbeard steps to the edge of the deck. No shouting, just a single motion of the hand, a slight tilt of the head, and his crew shifts instantly, as if they've rehearsed this moment 100 times. But just as he prepares to give the order for a final counterstrike, a strange sound cuts through the air. Not cannon fire, not wind, but dry wood cracking, like a door being locked from the outside. And in that instant, Blackbeard understands the worst truth of all. This is not a pursuit. This is a trap. If you enjoy real pirate case files told like a movie, subscribe now, because this story is not just about a confrontation. It is about how one man built an empire on fear, and why, in a single night, it all collapsed. To understand why the so-called Pirate King was driven into that inlet, we have to go back to before the name Blackbeard became law, before merchants rerouted their ships at the sound of 2 words, before ports closed earlier than usual, and sailors looked at the horizon like a death sentence. Blackbeard did not begin with a powerful fleet. He began with something far cheaper: psychology. He saw what most pirates never understood. Pirates hunt ships. Blackbeard hunted decisions. When the enemy slows down, changes course, abandons cargo just to escape, you win without firing a shot. He built his image into a weapon. Dark, cold, silent, appearing at the right moment, disappearing at the right place, and most importantly, making people believe resistance was useless. You could have cannons, you could have soldiers, but if your hands shake when you see his flag, everything you have becomes decoration. An empire at sea does not live on battles, it lives on routes. Blackbeard chose places ships were forced to pass through: narrow channels, harbor entrances, points where wind and current slowed vessels down. There he didn't need to chase, he only needed to wait. Imagine you are the captain of a merchant ship. Calm weather, calm sea, normal conversations on deck. Then at the edge of the fog, a dark sail appears. It doesn't need to come closer, it doesn't need to fire, it only needs to appear, and on your ship laughter dies before you can give an order. People look at each other, calculate escape routes, think about cargo, debts, families, and then faster than the wind, you slow down, you yield, because you don't want to become the story told in a tavern tonight. That is how Blackbeard took power, not through brute force, but by forcing others to make decisions for him. And when a decision repeats enough times, it becomes habit. When habit spreads, it becomes law. At sea, law does not always live on paper. It lives in shared fear. Blackbeard understood that perfectly. He didn't just steal, he priced peace, a fee to pass, a signal to be spared, a nod that let a ship continue. On land, they called it crime, but for sailors, it was sometimes a survival cost. And when merchants began adding that cost into their goods, an entire sea changed its rhythm. Prices rose, routes shifted, schedules changed, state revenue slowed like a tide being blocked. That was when everything escalated. You can ignore a group of pirates, but you cannot ignore someone who chokes trade routes. When money stops reaching port, When busy harbors turn anxious, when complaints pile up on desks, someone has to stand up, not for honor, but for interest. And here is the detail many miss. The state did not hunt Blackbeard because they hated him. They hunted him because he had become a competing system. He collected what only the state was supposed to collect: obedience. But there is another rule, colder than the sea itself. The larger the empire, the more traces it leaves. You need anchors, fresh water, repairs, information, sellers, buyers, silence, and every link leaves footprints. Blackbeard was powerful because he made people afraid, but that same fear created its opposite. Men who wanted fame by killing him, rewards by capturing him, promotion by proving the sea could not have a king other than theirs. And so the hunt began. Not a chase across open waters where Blackbeard always vanished, but a hunt with maps, habits, and patience, waiting at the one place he was guaranteed to appear. A narrow inlet, shallow water, a place where large ships could not turn, where a shift in wind could turn advantage into a trap. So remember the opening scene. Blackbeard was driven into that inlet not because he was weak, but because someone learned to play by his rules, silent, patient, setting the clamp in advance and waiting for the Pirate King to walk into it himself. And from here, the file moves to the next part. How Blackbeard built his empire like a machine, and why when one link broke, the entire machine collapsed in a single night. Blackbeard did not go pirating the way people imagine. He operated a system, a machine that fed on the sea's money, and once that machine was running, it ran on the habits of others, habits built on fear. Early in the morning offshore, the sea looks calm. No cannons, no smoke, just a line of merchant ships following familiar winds. Sailors speak quietly. The captain watches the compass. Everything feels like an ordinary day until a dark sail slides out of the fog like ink spreading across paper. It does not need to come closer. It does not need to fire. It only needs to appear in the right place. And instantly, the rhythm of breathing on deck changes. No one asks, "Do we fight?" They ask, "Is there a way out?" Blackbeard understood that moment. He created it. He fed it. On his ship, everything ran with steel-cold discipline, no pointless shouting, no chaos, ropes tied in order, flags raised at the exact moment, lanterns covered at the right time, and on deck Blackbeard stood like a period at the end of every hope of resistance. Sometimes he did not even need to step forward. One of his men would simply pull the black flag into view for a few seconds, just long enough to be seen, and the other ship would slow itself down, change course, stop on its own. This is the terrifying truth. Power does not live in what you do, but in what others do for you. On a small plank, a bag of goods is placed down, not a kneeling tribute, but a forced transaction, dry and cold, like paying a toll. Sometimes it is gold, sometimes medicine, sometimes rope, sailcloth, hardtack, the things that keep a fleet alive, the things that keep the machine running. And then, the part that makes people shake even more, the ship is allowed to leave. No ramming, no destruction, no noise, because Blackbeard did not want to win a battle. He wanted to plant a law, a simple law. Pay to pass in peace. Refuse and become an example. From that day, the sea changed, not because there were more pirates, but because people changed. Merchants began adding a Blackbeard fee into their cargo. Captains chose longer, more dangerous routes just to avoid a name. Men hired guards, bought cannons, stockpiled ammunition, but the thing they bought most was anxiety. In ports, doors closed earlier than usual. In taverns, stories shifted from boasting to whispers. On the docks, people looked at the sky not to read the wind, but to measure whether today was a bad day. And while the land was still arguing, Blackbeard moved one step further. He did not just stop ships, he controlled information. Small boats moved ahead like ghosts, flying no flags, drawing no attention, slipping close to ports, listening, checking cargo lists, departure schedules. News of a valuable shipment often reached Blackbeard earlier than the people waiting for it on shore. So he chose targets the way one chooses fish in a net, keeping what was worth money, releasing what was not, and the more he released, the larger the rumor grew. People spoke of him not as strong, but as all-seeing. An empire is not guns. An empire is the feeling that you are being watched, even when the sea is endless. At that level, Blackbeard was no longer just a pirate. He became a thorn in the throat of the state, because every ship stopped was lost tax. Every rerouted lane was strangled revenue, and every complaint letter piling up on a desk was a slap in the face of those in power. In closed rooms, maps were spread out, not to draw trade routes, but hunting routes. They did not say, catch a pirate. They said, dismantle a system, because no one fears a lone pirate, but everyone fears a man who turns the sea into his private toll booth. Orders were signed, patrol ships left port, but the sea was too vast and Blackbeard too skilled at vanishing. Chasing him across open water was like chasing smoke. That was when his enemies began learning to think like him. They did not ask, where is he? They asked, what does he need? Where does he get fresh water? Where does he shelter from storms? Where does he repair sails? Where does he sell stolen goods? And those questions led to the most important answer of all: habit. Even a king of the sea needs to anchor. And every time he anchors, he leaves a trace. At the same time, inside Blackbeard's own empire, a problem began to grow, quietly but deadly. Greed. When money flows, people want larger shares. When power rises, people want power of their own. Some begin to think they could be king too. Some start whispering behind backs, and some begin to value something more precious than gold: their own survival. You can capture a fleet with cannons, but you can collapse an empire with the right whisper to the right person. Blackbeard felt it, tightened discipline, moved faster, decided cleaner, stared colder. No debates, no negotiations, because he understood his empire survived on certainty. Hesitate once and the entire sea would smell weakness. But the tighter he gripped, the more visible he became. The stronger he grew, the more attention he drew, the higher he rose, the harder it became to disappear. And so the story moved into its most dangerous phase. The day Blackbeard was forced to choose a place to anchor. A place that felt safe, familiar, easy to control, a place he had used too many times, and a place where his enemies only had to sit still, study the map, and smile, because when you build an empire on the habits of others, you eventually become bound by your own habits. And from here on, it was no longer an empire. It became a hunt. A hunt where all it would take was a single night for everything to end. At a certain point, Blackbeard no longer needed to fight. The sea itself opened paths for him. A single dark sail on the horizon was enough to make entire merchant convoys turn away like schools of fish sensing a shark's shadow. People did not speak his name as they would a man. They spoke it like a disaster, something that appears, takes, and vanishes, leaving behind a silence heavy as stone. In the ports, change began in the smallest details. Warehouses closed earlier, dock workers lowered their voices, captains read cargo lists like sentences. Some voyages were delayed by nothing more than a rumor. Some routes were abandoned entirely because of a shadowed sail no one could even identify. Fear became a shared currency, and Blackbeard was its bank. But when you stand at the peak for too long, you begin to believe the sky belongs to you, and that is the most dangerous moment of all. Blackbeard started anchoring in familiar places, Not out of laziness, but practicality. Fresh water was there. Cellars were there. Shelter from storms was there. Escape routes were there. He used these places like lungs, breathing in, breathing out, returning to sea over and over again, efficient, smooth, and because of that, predictable. On the other side, there were men who were no longer afraid, or pretended not to be. Pirate hunters did not come to prove bravery. They came for bounties, for rank, for a name carved into history. And to earn any of that, they needed only one thing: Blackbeard. They did not chase the wind, they chased habit. On wooden tables in closed rooms, maps were spread out, not maps of glory, but maps of hunting. Trade lanes were crossed out, anchor points circled, inlets marked like trap mouths. And in the center, a streak of black ink, the place Blackbeard always returned to, as if the sea itself pulled him back in a silent loop. The plan chosen was brutally simple. Do not rush into open water. Do not chase a ghost. Stand at the exit, and when the ghost tries to pass, it will reveal itself. Small ships were prepared. Light, fast, silent. No banners, no display, no noise, moving at night, slicing across the water like blades. Orders were short. Block the way, force him into the shallows, deny the turn, deny escape. And at that same time, inside Blackbeard's own empire, something else began to crack. Trust. When money grows, mouths multiply. When loot piles up, eyes change color. Some began to think their share was too small. Some feared they would be next. Some looked toward land and imagined a life without sleeping with a knife under the pillow. And in the darkness of those thoughts, the most dangerous thing of all was born. Information. Information has a price. Information can buy life. Information can be traded for mercy. All it took was one name whispered to the right person. Blackbeard will anchor there. And that was enough. No loud betrayal, no blade in the back on deck. Just a sentence slipping through the right door. Blackbeard was not foolish. He felt the change in the air. He tightened discipline, issued orders faster, spoke less, watched more. On deck, men who once laughed loudly fell silent. Men who once drank freely stared into dark water as if at a warning. He knew the peak was the easiest place to die, but he also knew that if he showed retreat, the entire sea would smell weakness. And once the sea smells it, it rushes in. So Blackbeard did what rulers often do when they feel hunted. He chose to prove strength. A ship was stopped, a quick inspection made, a fee collected, a message sent in the coldest way possible. The Empire is still here. Do not test it. Do not dream. But in those reminders, he revealed his rhythm, his timing, the winds he preferred, the way he moved in and out like a man stepping through his own doorway. And on the other side of that doorway, small ships were already waiting. Night fell, fog thickened, tides shifted. The very things Blackbeard once used to disappear now returned as a curtain for his enemies. No warning cannon, no trumpet, just the distance between hulls shrinking, beat by beat, like a noose being slowly pulled tight. A dark sail appeared at the mouth of the inlet. Blackbeard believed it was the familiar way home, believed he would anchor, take water, make repairs, and return to sea as always. But this time, the inlet was no longer a door. It was a clamp. And when his ship slid into the shallows, when the bow grew heavy, when the rudder began to resist, when the sails lost wind at the one moment they needed it most, Blackbeard understood. Hunters do not win with strength. They win by making the king of the sea walk into the exact place they want. From here there was no detour, no vanishing act, no legend left, only a single night ahead. The night when the Empire would have to answer its final question. Can fear save anyone once the trap has closed? Blackbeard realized he was trapped the moment the ship stopped obeying him. Not because the wind was strong, but because the wind had changed. Not because the sea was vast, but because the water was shallow. His empire was built to win in open space, where he could turn, split formation, and vanish behind a curtain of mist. But here, everything collapsed into a narrow, dark corridor. The exit ahead was blocked. The banks on both sides rose like teeth, and behind him the rising tide pushed the ship forward in exactly the wrong direction. On deck, discipline remained, but time did not. Ropes were hauled tight, sails adjusted, men moved on command like a machine trying to start while buried in mud. Blackbeard stood at the center of it all, not shouting, not panicking, staring straight at the enemy ship as if facing a question he had never been forced to answer in his life. If fear no longer works, what is left? Lightning split the sky again, and in that flash, the distance between the two. Ships became brutally clear, not far, not enough to escape, only enough to collide. And Blackbeard chose the only option a king of the sea has when cornered. He attacked head-on. The order came sharp as a blade. His men surged forward, hooks thrown, lines pulled hard. The deck shuddered, wood groaned, boots pounded, breath came fast like a storm, all unfolding in a few heartbeats with no room for hesitation. This was no longer about collecting a fee. This was a fight for an exit. But in confined space, every familiar advantage turned against him. The larger ship turned slowly, every change of direction like dragging iron through sand. The wind filled the sails, then died, then snapped back like a cruel joke, and in the moment that felt like a break, the keel was dragged down by the bottom again. One wrong move meant stuck, and stuck meant finished. The enemy did not need noise or display. They did not need to prove anything. They simply followed the plan. Lock, press, wait. Every time Blackbeard tried to wrench his machine free, they cut an angle, blocked a turn, held the space. This was not a contest of muscle, it was a contest of position, and in that contest, Blackbeard was standing on a board arranged by someone else. On deck, silence began to feel more terrifying than sound, not because the fighting stopped, but because everyone understood that legend protects no one in shallow water. The name Blackbeard, once enough to make an entire sea bow, could not deepen the water by a single inch. And when the final moment came, it did not arrive with trumpets or spectacle, it came like a door closing. An empire built on fear was finally betrayed by fear itself, as men who lived under the legend began to understand that legend was not armor, it was only a story, and stories can end. After that night, the sea changed its rules immediately, not because storms vanished or winds softened, but because the symbol was broken. Roots that once twisted reopened. Ships that once slowed themselves dared to sail straight. Voices that once whispered began to speak aloud, and those who once collected fees found themselves hunted. Blackbeard vanished from the sea the same way he had shaped it, leaving behind a void that felt both relieving and chilling, because what remained was not just loot, it was a lesson that at sea, power sometimes lives not in weapons, but in psychology, that a single man can turn fear into law, and that such a law can last a very long time until someone patient enough builds a trap, cold enough to wait, and steady enough not to tremble at a name that once made an entire sea tremble. And now it is your turn. If you were the commander of the hunt, would you chase across open water or drive the prey into the shallows to end it in a single night? Leave your choice in the comments. And if you want the next file to cut even deeper, the story of Captain Kidd will show you how sometimes a pirate hunter dies like a criminal for one word alone: treasure.